Thanks for coming. Um, Appreciate you all turning out this afternoon. It's not the most pleasant weather for getting out and about, but it beats being in the garden maybe in this kind of weather, huh? So it's kind of a surprise when you hit this time of the season after all the flurries of August and September and being so crowded with produce that you can't give it away fast enough to realize that there is an end. And that end suddenly hits us, and then we are resorting to purchasing our groceries again, and that's just not right. So, what I wanted to talk today about is about summer gardening for winter eating, the things that'll staple crops that will get you through the slow season. Now, obviously, there are options. You can dry foods, you can foods, freeze foods, ferment or pickle foods for longer term preservation. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not what we're going to talk about today because a couple of things. Big thing of that is that there's a certain volumetric of material that you have to do to make that worthwhile. When you're talking about blanching for freezing or running a pressure canner, you have to have a big enough garden and enough time to dedicate to processing to make those work. It requires some specialized knowledge, some specialized equipment to make that happen. So these are great techniques, but we have other ways to eat through the winter from our summer efforts. So there are foods that store fresh. Now, different types of crops have different capabilities for fresh storage, but also different requirements for fresh storage. Some require a period of curing before they're in a state where they are ready to be stored for longer term harvest or longer term consumption. The traditional example of this is the old fashioned root cellars. A very common thing back a half a century ago. We happen to live in a climate where root cellaring is challenging. We have a very wet climate with irregular warm and cool spells. And in this particular area, the clay soils make it very difficult to actually insulate or isolate crops from the weather in an outdoor situation. There are ways to make root cellaring doable here. We're going to glance over that mostly. We'll talk about other means of storage. So it's a popular way to store some of these crops for longer term. You're going to have to take some slightly different approaches to the traditional root cellar here, unfortunately. Refrigerated food storage. So a number of crops actually hold up surprisingly well under refrigeration. We'll talk about that in some detail here. The big problem with modern refrigeration versus the refrigeration around World War II, modern refrigeration is dry, very dry. It tends to dehydrate anything you put in the refrigerator. So you do have to make accommodation for that because refrigerated storage for these summer and fall harvested crops requires a high level of humidity, around 90-95% humidity for them to hold up well. So you have to kind of trap that moisture in. The other limitation to refrigerated storage, of course, is space, because you use your refrigerator all the time for all kinds of varieties of produce and other goods. So there's a limited amount you can do in refrigerated storage unless you invest in several refrigerators, and I have a couple for that very reason. But it is a valid way of holding a number of crops for fairly extensive periods of time. And finally, we can talk about winter to spring harvest crops. These are things we're planting in the summer, growing through the fall, and then they're sitting there in the garden for harvest late fall, early winter, in a few cases, all the way through the winter or into the early spring. And one of the truisms about cold climate living is that winter isn't your starving period. Spring is your starving period. Winter, you still have everything you've stored going into it. By spring, you're running out of stores and nothing new and fresh is really coming along to replace it. So having these handful of crops that actually can be produced for February harvest is a big benefit. So storable summer and fall harvest crops. So these are crops that you would normally be growing as part of your main sequence plantings. Stuff that's mostly planted late spring, mid to late spring, grown and harvested August, September, October, in a few cases grown over winter, biennial crops, for harvest in June. And so these are crops that not only harvest in these periods, but can be held for months without much extra care. Beets. Everybody thinks of beets as pretty much either a canned product or a very fresh out of the garden product. But they're actually easy to grow and easy to store in refrigeration. Typical cropping on beets is to go ahead and plant in April or May as part of your major growing season, and then harvest them in August-ish, or especially for a longer term storage, plant in July to August with a planned harvest in about October. Now, beets are kind of a weird crop. You put a seed in the ground, you don't get one plant. You get a whole batch of plants. The actual beet seed is a drupe that's dried, so there's several seeds inside. Thinning is essential, or you will never get actual beets. They'll just kind of sit there with little tufts of green and never expand. So your April to May plantings would normally harvest roughly July or August, sometimes by the end of June. And plantings done in July or August usually harvest fall through winter. You can ground store beets. So ground storing crops are crops that you can leave in the ground, not harvest all at once or not harvest rapidly, and they'll hold up for delayed sequential harvesting. There's quite a bit of variation from crop to crop in how well they hold up to that. Beets hold up pretty well. Typically, you'll find your beets that you don't pull in the late summer or fall really stop developing much about the middle of October. They're not increasing, but they're not necessarily declining. However, beets are not the most cold hardy, insect resistant, or wet soil tolerant crop either. So generally, as we get through that later part of the fall, getting up around mid-November, going towards Thanksgiving, I try to make sure I've got all my beets out of the ground by that point in time. So when you've got your beets out of the ground, you want to dig or pull them gently, try to avoid any heavy bruising or serious damage to them. Wash them, get the dirt and gunk off of them, especially if the rains have already kicked in the fall. Trim them. Take all the greens off if you're going to be long-term storing them. If you're just going to hold them for a few days, keeping the greens on is not a problem. If you're going to be holding them for several months, you need to get the greenery off. I don't normally do much root trimming on beets, just enough to get the finest of the hair roots off the bottom, and then let them nice air dry to the point where they're not shrivelly or rubbery, but not obviously visibly moist yet. From there, you just put them in an airtight container. I use just plastic grocery bags and just twist the tops good. Throw them in the produce drawer in your refrigerator. They can hold for several months, 3 or 4, maybe 5 months under refrigeration if you get them to that stage and you can keep enough humidity in with them. Now, beets are kind of a variable thing. Some of the real high sugar content beets may not hold up quite as well in refrigerated storage. They go through deterioration faster. Some varieties definitely do this better than others. Lutz Greenleaf, Touchstone, and Flat of Egypt are some of the best varieties I've found for storage. Those are also the varieties that will tend to hold up the latest into the fall and even possibly early winter in the ground without going corky or losing texture. Carrots are kind of similar to beets in that regard. They are really, really, really slow to start from seed. 21 plus days to first sprout from seed is really common. This means don't give up the ship too fast and go out and reseed them. I do that a lot, and then I end up with way too many carrots because I've sown them twice in the same spot. Most varieties of carrots hold up well refrigerated. Plantings can be done again, April, May for summer harvest, July through August for fall to winter harvest. There are select varieties that can be overwintered for spring harvest, but not all carrots do that well. Many carrots left in the ground for that long a period of time over that particular weather conditions end up either very woody or very hairy, but some varieties don't. We'll talk about that on the next slide. Thinning is required. You seed your carrots heavily because germination is not only slow, but it's erratic. So you need to be able to thin it down to reasonable spacings. But carrots are one of the highest producing per square foot crops you can plant in the garden. And couple that with their storage capability, you should be planting more than you do. So April through June plantings will typically harvest starting maybe as early as July through September. Use those fresh, although they will refrigerate well. July and August plantings are normally harvested in the fall, October into November for me. Normally, I got my last batch of that crop out of the ground the very last week of October this year, in perfect condition, no deterioration at all. In fact, by that point in time, they're a little sweeter than your typical summer harvested carrots. Specific varieties that overwinter are usually planted in late August or early September from seed. If you push too late into that, you have a real slow start to them. But don't expect to see too much of them in that initial flush. So August plantings, these carrots will pop up. You'll get a little bit of size of them, and as those temperatures drop down, those soil temperatures drop down, they just sit there, and you got these little tufts of foliage, and sometimes even the foliage dies back and doesn't look like they're doing anything. But they come roaring back to finish off in February for a March to April harvest. And having a fresh crop out of the ground in March and April is really, really nice. So for all varieties, dig gently, try to avoid serious breakage or other major damage. Wash, get all the dirt off of them. Clip the tops. There's usually shouldn't be enough hair roots to bother with much thorough cleaning in that sense of removal of roots. A couple of roots that are light and stringy is not a problem. If you got a lot of hairiness on your carrots, check them before you bother storing them. They may not be any good. That's often a sign that they've turned over a little bit. Get them nice and clean, trimmed up the tops, air dried again to a reasonable texture and not bone dry. And again, sealed container, plastic bag works in refrigeration. So these refrigerated crops, you want to get the temperatures right down there, 35, 36 degrees, up to maybe 40 degrees on the upper end of that cold storage. So this is why we don't just slap them out in the garage and let them be. Even in the winter, you're probably too warm out there for long-term storage. Carrots, most varieties can hold 4 or 5 months in refrigerated storage. There is some decline in quality past the 3rd or 4th month, however. A couple of varieties out there, Autumn King and Merida are ones I've actually done myself that are intentional overwintering varieties. Late summer to early fall planting for harvest, and usually for me it's about April by the time they're big enough to bother with. Outside of the overwintering carrots, I do a lot of Bolero and Mokum. Very, very good all-around growing condition. Danvers and Oxheart are wedgy, thick, big, broad carrots. This is good in heavier soils. These are also varieties that will hold up longer if you're leaving them in the ground later than most other varieties. So great potential for ground storage. Danvers half long, really solid variety. Garlic is a great example of biennial cropping and a great introduction to overwinter gardening. Garlic stores very, very easily under normal household storage conditions. Typically, garlic is planted from bulbs as early as September, theoretically as late as March, but the earlier you can get them in the ground in the fall, the better your yields will be. There's some variation on exact harvest time from variety to variety, but most of the garlic varieties will finish sometime between the end of June and the end of July. So you're growing them literally over the winter from fall planting for harvest in June to July of the following year. When you harvest them, you want to get them out of the ground. They're often deeper than you think if you're doing this right. I've put mine down about 6 inches lately, and I'm getting much bigger bulbs because of it. So it does involve some significant digging to get to the bulb out. You should cut off your irrigation to your garlic crops about 3 weeks before you plan to harvest. So as you're watching the garlic development, the bottom leaves are beginning to yellow and senesce, working their way slowly up, and you might be starting to get a little bit of looseness or floppiness to the greens. Cut off your water the moment you start seeing that. 2 weeks later, you go out and dig them. Do not wash, handle, clean them any more than is absolutely necessary to get them out of the ground safely. You need to cure your garlic. Cure them in a dark location or to moderate light, but not full sun, warm and dry location. I literally spread them out on sheets of cardboard in my garage where they're not getting any direct sun. I don't have a window that's sun exposed for them. Takes about 3 weeks usually before they harden off enough to be storable. All the foliage finishes kind of yellowing down. Once you have hit that stage, 3 weeks of curing, you can either trim the roots and tops to store individual bulbs, or re-wet and braid the tops if you're doing braided storage. There are a batch of different types of garlic beyond just simply variety names. There are hardneck, softneck, and elephant garlics. So hardneck garlics typically have larger individual bulbs, but fewer of them, and they typically are really rich in flavor. But they have a limited storage capability, usually just a couple of months, 3, maybe 4 months. A few of the long storing types might last a little bit longer. Softneck varieties do not have that central hard stem and flower scape. They're just filled with cloves all the way to the center. They typically store much, much longer. 8 months is certainly possible. 9, 12. I can get 12 on a good year, or I get 8 or 9 pretty typically on mine. I do not keep them as dry as I should as part of the problem. Long-term storage is moderate temperatures. So we're talking about 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, dry, and relatively dark, though you do not need to be as obsessive about darkness as you would with storing potatoes, for example. You can keep them relatively dark, dry, and without the temperatures surging up, they'll hold for a long period of time. If any of those vary much, you get much humidity, you get a lot of light, or if you're getting substantially warmer temperatures, they're going to try to start growing again, even in the air, and then the storage life is done for them. Storage varieties. Enchelium red, Nootka rose, I do quite a bit of those. Polish softneck is another fun one to play with. Pretty much all the softnecks will store well. None of the hardnecks store superbly well. Elephant garlic is a completely different critter. It's actually a type of leek that forms a bulb rather than being stem harvested. It grows like a hardneck, but it stores more like a softneck. The storage capability of elephant garlic is quite good, so you can treat it essentially the same. Many people with elephant garlic go ahead and separate out the cloves for longer term storage, however. Onions are another great biennial crop, and there's a whole batch of different ways you can do onions. You can plant onions from seed, you can do onions from bulb sets, you can do onions from green bunches. Seeds and bulb sets are grown as an overwintered crop. Your bunching sets are planted in the very, very early spring for harvest that same summer. So there's a reason for the behaviors here. Onions are, just like the garlic, are day length regulated. Really, regardless of when you get them in the ground, they're going to try to set maturation based on how long the days are. So we don't really do short day onions here because they are trying to ripen at the wrong time of year and they don't finish right. We do mostly long day onions here, although we can also do intermediate, or what they call them day neutral, but they're really intermediate day onions. And the long day onions provide your best storage capability onions out there. So not all varieties, however, store as well. Growing patterns. Starting seed in June, July for transplant as seedling transplants. August, September is kind of the baseline for doing this, and everything else is kind of based upon that growing pattern. It is a pain to get your onion seed to sprout direct sown in June, July. So most people are starting these in trays and then moving them out. If you have a particular hankering for some specific varieties that aren't as widely available, this is really the way to do them. However, if you're just looking for good storage onions and you're not so particular about specific varieties, it's far and away not the easiest way to grow your onions. You can get hard storage sets, hard bulbs that are ready to plant, usually starting again about September, about when the garlic comes in, and you can plant them again through about February or early March and still have reasonable success, but the earlier the better. Plant those out in the ground and they'll grow into a full-size storage onion for harvest in June, July. This is good. They're easy to handle, they're easy to plant. However, because of the process of growing them to a stage and then forcing them to dormant down for harvest for sale, right, as a bulb, they have a higher incidence of bolting. Now, when your garlic bolts, sets a little flower spike, no harm, no foul. It doesn't really impact the crop. When an onion bolts, it really stops setting bulb size, and it creates a hollow cavity through the middle of the onion. Now, if you pick that onion and you don't use it right away, that green stem going down through the center of that onion declines and starts to rot. And then your bulbs start rotting from the inside out. So when you see flower sets starting up on an onion, get it out of the ground, even if it's not quite to normal harvest period. Just use it right away and it's fine, but don't plan on storing that onion. And when you do that from hard sets, that can be sometimes a substantial percentage of the onions in question do that. Buying green bunches of onions for planting in February is a really easy way to grow storage onions. Now you can get also sweet onions, but sweet onions don't store. Bunches of onions planted in February are still harvesting the same period, June, July. This is what would happen if you started your seed and then transplanted it in July yourself, grew it in July, August, and grew it over. You would have, by the time you're in February, you would have these bunches like this. Somebody's just doing this production stage for you because it is kind of a pain. And so they just sandbed them, lift them out at that stage of development and ship them all over the country for gardeners to put in the ground. Simplifies the process dramatically. Yes, you spend a little bit more money on it. For me, it's quite worth it. Thank you very much. So harvest is divided by day length. Long day onions are our storage onions. Some of the intermediate days store pretty well as well. Really important to get them growing well when you first get them in the ground. So your fall feedings are summer and fall feedings are very important to get the size up going into the winter. You may need to supplementally water as the springs dry out a little bit. But again, like with garlic, plan on withholding water about 2 to 3 weeks before harvest to allow the extra layers of paper to develop on the outside. That's what will keep the onion intact over the longer storage period. Typically, you can tell they're hitting their maturation as they start shouldering up. They start pushing the top of the onion up out of the ground. Onions are nowhere near as deep as garlic. This is not a problem. You do not need to nor want to bury those shoulders. In fact, you want to make sure you never have dirt or compost mulch or even straw mulch up around the necks of the onions themselves. That can create a rot in the neck that goes down into the bulb and again, eliminates the storability. So don't bury the shoulders. Your tops will start to get kind of floppy. When a goodly percentage of your onions are pretty well bent over, you can go ahead and harvest out the whole bed. If you have cut off your irrigation, you don't need that spot for anything. As long as you're not getting them wet, you can pick a few at a time, leave them in the ground, and just keep going as you need them. There's no harm, no foul there. You do want to make sure, though, that you get the last of that crop out of the ground before we're hitting substantial frosts in the fall or before the rains come in the fall, because both of those factors will pretty much ruin your crop at that point. So gently lift them. They really don't need to be dug. They're just rooted in there, and you should be able to just pull them pretty much out of the ground, except in my clay. Sometimes I actually have to take a fork to them. Try to avoid injuring the onions in any way. Do not wash them. Do not clean them. Don't handle them excessively. Set them out to cure in a warm, dry, dark location, just like with garlic. They're very close cousins. About 2 to 3 weeks of curing. Then you can trim the roots, trim the tops, and move them into longer term storage. As with garlic, best storage temps are moderate. People make the mistake of trying to store their onions too cold, whether we're talking about onions you're growing yourself or onions you pick up in the grocery store. Onions under 35, 36 degrees in the refrigerator decline rapidly. Onions at 45, 46 degrees in the garage don't. So keep them in the moderate temperature range and dry. Now, even within the long day onions, of course, not all are storage varieties. Walla Walla sweets and other sweet type onions have a high sugar content. They do not store well. You might get a couple of months out of them. That's all you're going to get out of them. So by the time your Walla Wallas are out of the ground, you're done before Thanksgiving. They will not hold past that. Storage onions, varieties like Copra or Patterson or Stuttgart, Talons, the old classic yellow globes, can store for many months. And I'm going to run out of onions before I run out of storage life at this point. I'm still eating the onions from my late June harvest right now, and I will be for several more months. Potatoes. So potatoes, classic summer crop. We don't always think about how much of a staple they are, know what capability they have for storage. The storage life does vary quite a bit from variety to variety. Again, they're stored under household conditions, but with some modifications. Potatoes are usually planted March, April, or May. They can be planted as late as June. A few varieties maybe as late as July and still get a crop off. There have been historical precedents of doing other planting periods like fall plantings, but frankly, our weather is not really suited for overwintering potatoes, even though it happens accidentally if you leave some in the ground sometimes. Depending on the variety and the planting period, your potato harvest period will be somewhere starting as early as the end of June and potentially as late as the end of September or first part of October. You want to make sure you're digging those potatoes very carefully, avoiding injury. Don't stab them with your fork. I do about probably 8 or 9%. Probably got holes in them by the time I get them out of the ground. It goes with the territory. How do you know when they're ready? Well, okay, so your potatoes are growing along, foliage is up. They don't always, but often you will see a very brief flush of flower on the top of your greenery. That indicates early stage of potato development, tuber development. You can actually start harvesting little tiny baby, what they call new potatoes out of that if you don't want much crop volume. You just like the novelty of having the really fresh little ones. From that point, several weeks, depending on the variety, might be 3 or 4 weeks past that point, you see no matter how much you're watering, how much you're feeding, the foliage will begin to senesce. You start seeing a progressive yellowing from the bottom up, and it'll actually start falling apart. The moment you see much progression of yellow senescence happening in your potatoes, stop watering. They need to thicken those skins again, or they're not going to hold well. So at that point in time, you can dig them once you've got a goodly portion of the foliage pretty well yellowed down. If you are not irrigating them and you do not need the ground and you don't have too much problem with rodents or soil insects, you could leave them in the ground and just dig them as needed. My father does that with a lot of his crop of potatoes and just digs them slowly over the course of the summer and fall. On the other hand, there's a lot that can go wrong in ground storing potatoes. My tendency is to get the whole crop out of the ground, get it prepared, and get it in storage before something goes wrong. Potatoes in storage have 2 potential issues. Light causes them to want to start growing. The skins will start greening up. That green material is not edible. They are a nightshade. And it ruins the potato really rapidly as the sprouts start coming out. Potatoes that are kept on the wrong temperature range go one of 2 ways. If they're kept substantially too warm, they actually shrink and shrivel. They start losing water and solidity in the tuber itself. Potatoes that are stored too cold, anything much below about 40, maybe 45 degrees, develop sugars. They stop tasting like potatoes. It's kind of an interesting thing. So moderate temperatures, 50, 55 degree, ideal for storage, dark and dry. When you get them out of the ground, dig carefully to avoid injury, wash them, get the dirt off of them, get them significantly air dried and significantly dried before you actually agglomerate them all together to store. You can put a fair number of potatoes together, but the more layer and the more volume you're condensing them into, the more you're packing them into tight spaces, the more likely that one bad potato is going to spoil the batch. So spreading them out, getting them well cured before you put them into a longer term storage is a really good idea. Good storing varieties might hold 6, 7 months, maybe 8 months. They can store for that long. Thick-skinned potatoes, of course, are typically your best storing varieties, russet Burbanks and their like. But a goodly number of the thinner-skinned varieties hold up pretty well. German Butterball, Kennebecs, Cal White is one of my personal favorites when I can get it. A few of the fingerling types, rose fin apple, Russian banana also store well, but many of the fingerlings do not. So it's not uniform across the batch. Even when we say not storing well, even varieties that don't store well are likely, if well handled, to store for at least 4 months. So it's about the question of how long for any given variety. So when I harvest out, I usually do 3 or 4 varieties. I love my Yukon Golds, even though they're only going to hold for 4 months for me usually. Make sure we segregate them out in storage so we can tell who's who quickly. And we make sure we go through the varieties that aren't going to hold before we work our way into the longer storage varieties, just so we can keep going. I got a whole drawer full of potatoes that are sitting out there that we're still working our way through. I never seem to plant quite enough. Usually by sometime around March, I'm running out of potatoes, just about in time to plant the next batch, but not enough time for the first harvest. So I should dedicate a little more space to them. Okay, squashes are kind of a complex topic, so we're going to spend a little time on this one. Winter squashes is what we're talking about in this case, rather than your summer squashes like zucchinis and crooknecks. Winter squashes, there's pumpkins, there's delicatas, buttercups, sweetmeats, kabochas, curries, lots and lots of types. And there's some significant variation within those groups about how they store and how they handle. Squashes, winter squashes are stored under essentially household conditions again, and they just like your potatoes and garlic, they don't need a lot of specialty holding. They do need some space because they can be a very productive crop. Squashes are grown as part of your main sequence of gardening, planted usually in late April or early May and grown through the summer for late summer to fall harvest. So most winter squashes are harvested September to October, possibly November. By November, you're starting to get into some risks of some rots, storage rots and such developing, so be a little careful. The different varieties have somewhat differing indicators to tell when they are really, really ready to harvest. You'll have to do a little bit of reading up because I can't spend the entire session on it, but basically your typical indicators are either the thickness and hardness of the rind on the outside of the fruit. Can you thrust a thumbnail into it or not? That's one of the indicators. The other indicators are your stem and vine development. When the stems start actually curing out and drying, even though they're still attached to the vine, that squash is pretty well done. So those are kind of the basics there. The thing about storing pumpkins, it's a little different from storing onions or garlic, or squashes rather than pumpkins or than onions or garlic, is they need a little humidity. If you try to store them bone dry, they're going to decay. Eventually, they're going to shrivel and decay. The inner flesh will soften up. So you need a little bit of humidity in the storage, not 95%, not like we're talking about the refrigerator crops, but really dry is not good for them. When you get them off the vine, in general, you're going to want to wash them. If you're really excited about extending your storage life, you make a very fine bleach water solution, say 1 part of bleach in 10 to 12 parts of water, and you rinse them off with that to make sure you're taking some of the bacteria off the outer skin. I'm usually not that dedicated. A good wash down with a wet rag is usually enough to get the dirt and grime off them and keep most of the bad organisms off them to get them into storage. Get them very, very air dried before you ever do any stacking or conglomerating of them. So some winter squashes require significant curing post-harvest. Others do not. Winter squashes that do not require curing are things like delicatas, table ace, and similar acorn squashes, vegetable spaghetti or spaghetti squash. These will hold maybe 2 or 3 months in storage. They don't hold for very, very long, but not horribly, but do not require any prep. They're pretty much ready to eat off the vine. Hubbards, kabochas, including the curries, pink banana, most of the buttercups, really do require some substantial warm curing, and it has to be warm. And this is one of the things that limits late harvesting of squashes. You really need to cure those for about 2 weeks at quite warm temperatures, 70 to 75 degrees, to get them to finish ripening inside and to finish hardening the outer shell for storage. So we normally leave the stems on at picking to avoid injuring the stem attachment. But once they're done curing, you are free to take those handles or those stem pieces off if you so desire. In fact, that can often extend your storage life if you're looking at really long-term storage. So curing types like this can hold 3 to 4 months easily with top quality, and out to 6 to 8 months potentially on the really long storing varieties. Blue curries in the kabocha group, sweetmeats can store that long. Pumpkins are different slightly. They are more like a non-cure squash, but often you're getting them off the vine. They're not really quite done. They do benefit from a 5 to 10 day warm curing, especially if they're not fully colored or fully hardened yet when you take them off the vine. But no matter how much time you spend curing them, you're not going to get more than a couple of months of storage out of them. So use them sooner rather than later. Don't anticipate getting them all through the winter. So no cure types, 3 months, moderate temperatures, 50, 55 degrees, medium humidity. Curing types after the curing will hold for a long period of time, and some varieties you might play with. No cure types, delicatas and bush delicatas, spaghetti squash, honey boats. Curing types, butternuts. Waltham butternut actually has a pretty good storage life as butternuts go, not as long as the kabochas. Red curry, also a moderate storing. Blue curry, sweet meats, and pink bananas can hold up for tremendously long periods of time in storage. Now, pumpkins vary quite a bit in how well they store. If you're looking to hold a full 3 or maybe even 4 months on a pumpkin, try Rouge Vif de Temple, the old classic Cinderella pumpkin, low and flat, darker red, orange, and the distinctive ribs. Howden, one of the more popular, typical cooking pumpkins, holds up pretty well in storage. The small sugar types hold up pretty well in storage. Sweet potatoes. A long cycle crop, takes a very long time, takes up a lot of space in the garden. Yields are tremendous. Storage life is phenomenal. They store under household conditions, but a bit different from regular potatoes. So you can start your own slips in March or April for transplant, or you can buy commercially prepared slips that are ready to plant May or June. Towards the end of May, after we've got some soil temperature. Don't try to get them in the ground too early. They really suffer under low temperatures. You want to harvest your sweet potatoes as late into the season as you can tolerate. So what will ruin your sweet potatoes is repeated substantial rainfall, making the soil muddy, or a couple of frosts. So the first frost is great. You start seeing that foliage die back from a minimal frost in early to mid-October, plan on digging them soon. Timing the rain is the funky one. Sometimes if the frosts don't come and the rains delay, deciding when to get them out of the ground. The good news is it's mostly about overall finished yield. Anything that you can dig and bother peeling and cooking or processing and cooking is edible. They're not bad. It's just that the longer you leave them in, the more sheer size and volume you will get. You need to handle and dig them very gently. They look tough, they feel tough, but they bruise incredibly easily and they scratch and tear really easily. So harvesting is kind of a pain. You've got a clump in the center and vines going out 4 or 5 feet in all directions from the clump. So we're talking about 25, 30 square feet per plant. Big crop. Normally I'll go through and I'll cut all the vines off at several inches above the crown, and then I'll start out about 18 inches away from the crown, gently and slowly digging and turning, working my way down and in until I start finding tubers. And then from there, it's a lot of hands in the dirt, trying to brush the dirt out from around the tubers, getting down underneath them, being able to lift them out without damaging them. And don't drop them in the bucket. They bruise, they really do. Gently set them in the bucket as you're going through. You can get 20 pounds of sweet potatoes, potentially. That'd be a really good yield, but it happens. Putting real typical for me to put in 3 plants and get about 45 pounds of sweet potatoes out of 3 plants. You can dry garden them if you're into that sort of thing, but it does impact your yield. Get them out very, very carefully, very gently. Do not wash, do not handle any more than is absolutely necessary. Do not try to clean them up. Spread them out. Again, sheets of cardboard in the garage is great for this. At least 3 weeks to get them nice and hardened up. Once they're fully cured and their sugar has developed, now this curing needs to be reasonably warm, 65 degrees or more, 75 is better. Once they're cured, the temperature can ameliorate a little bit. But if you're storing them below 65, the sugars that build up in them in the curing process slowly fade away. They lose quality, though not storage quality. So good idea to keep them warm. So like my potatoes, keep in the garage or inside. Onions I store and garlic I store out in the garage long-term, 45 degrees, holds that pretty well for the most part. Sweet potatoes are indoors in the laundry room. They really need household temperatures to hold the sugars. Dry is a relative term. Much humidity is going to shorten their lifespan. They do not need to be bone dry. They do need to be kept dark because, again, they will, like potatoes, they will start sprouting as the season progresses. That's just how you start slips for them if you really get into them. 6 to 8 months storage capability easily. So October harvest, that means you're clear well into the late spring, early summer before you're out of sweet potatoes if you plant enough. Not all sweet potatoes do well here. We are at kind of the northern limit of that. Murasaki Purple, Georgia Jet, Covington, and Beauregard are all varieties I do regularly, and they're all very successful here. A crop that's not much thought of as storage crops, but has some potential. Tomatoes, but only certain varieties. So this picture is 3 days ago. Yeah. Only a few varieties hold up. So storage tomatoes, you might get some ripening on the vine over the course of the summer, but not much. They just start beginning to color, as you see in the tomatoes there in the box, but not in the basket. As the rains start coming in the fall, the temperatures really start dropping, the vines start senescing, you pick everything that's showing any tinge of color. And then you put them in a moderate light, moderate temperature environment to slowly continue ripening off the vine. As they start developing color, you can throw them into the windowsill to hasten the process along a few at a time as you need them. Once they're at the full color, and in this case, long keeper here, it's kind of a orangish yellow. Then they can go into the refrigerator for storage for a few more weeks past that. The longest I can usually manage to keep storage tomatoes going is about first week of January. By that time, the quality is really declining on them. Yes, there's often a few out there. You will have to go through off your harvest and sort them every couple of weeks and see who's ripening and if any of them are rotting, because you do lose some. But having fresh tomatoes in December and January is really astonishing. So most success I've had with variety-wise is long keeper. Moderate temperatures and moderate humidity for their storage period until they're completely ripe, and then refrigerated storage. Mid-December through late December, early January is about the final limit on that. So those are crops that are technically summer crops, summer to fall, but there's a whole batch of crops that we can grow through the winter as well. Arugula, one of the far easiest greens to grow for the winter cycle. If you're really going to harvest them over the winter instead of just late into the fall or early in the spring, you really will need some kind of covers to keep them growing. It's a crop that's planted from seed in July or September. Harvest can be as early as late September, potentially through the winter under covers, and a good February sprout is really common. You need to check them regularly and harvest lightly. This means normally harvesting outer leaves and bottom leaves, working your way in as they grow. And there's a number of varieties, but there's not that much variation in varieties. Typically, you have either milder or more bitter arugulas. Astro, Italian cress are some mild varieties. Wasabi and red dragon can be downright hot, a little more peppery than I like my greens personally. We think of broccoli as primarily a summer crop, and it is, but there are varieties for fall harvest. But there are also varieties that overwinter for spring harvest, a few varieties that harvest late winter as is. Your varieties that are winter harvest and overwintering aren't your traditional head formers. They're sprouting broccolis. Instead of having a single large central head, you're harvesting what is effectively a collection of side shoots. It's also worth mentioning because all the broccoli I planted in the spring and harvested the heads in the early summer, and then had growing in the garden all summer, fall, and it's taking side shoots off, are still there. We've only had a couple of 28, 29 degree frosts. That's not enough to hurt broccoli. So a picture there is, again, a few days ago out in my garden, all those little side shoots that are still coming off. I'm getting, out of 5 plants, I'm getting about 1 to 2 meals of broccoli a week off of the side shoots from the crop I harvested, from the plants I planted for summer harvest. And so varieties that side shoot well and hold up well: Bell Star, Emerald Crown, Umpqua. But there are some varieties that's specific for winter and spring harvest. Rudolph, kind of a newer sprouting variety, harvests usually December to January, very, very, very late winter. More commonly, your green sprouting and purple sprouting broccolis are harvested about February from an overwintered crop. Broccoli is not super, super hardy. You do need to be aware that if we get down in the teens or lower, you could lose your crop, especially if they're already begun forming heads. Once you've got them out of the ground, broccoli doesn't really store. Refrigerated storage on broccoli is about 3 weeks under good conditions. So Brussels sprouts, another crop that is best, in the winter. Yes, you can grow them for summer to fall harvest, but they're much better after they've had some substantial cold weather. They sweeten up nicely. They have a lot of insect problems, and timing is tricky because they're a very long crop. So you plant in May to June for harvest in September or beyond. Pick individual sprouts off the bottom of the stems about the time they're hitting 1 to 1.5 inches in diameter, much bigger, and they start losing some flavor characteristics and some toughness. They will continue to mature even through the winter up the stem, so you just pick a few at a time as you're going as you need. They don't store super well, so again, pick what you want for immediate use. They are quite hardy, 10 degrees or colder. So we seldom freeze them out here. You usually can go out there and brush the snow off of them and pick them if you want. Some varieties that hold up really well, Rudnerf and Franklin hold up substantially well. I've taken to growing kalettes. Kalettes are a cross between Brussels sprouts and kale. So instead of all the balls of Brussels sprouts, you have these little tufts of little kale-like foliage all up the stem. Other than that, they're grown basically the same. If you can keep the aphids off them going into winter, you'll be fine. If you can't, be aware that the aphids don't go away in the winter. They just slow down. So you will need to do a really good job of cleaning, and you'll lose some to aphid predation. Cabbage has a lot of varieties and a lot of potential in the winter garden. As a brassica crop, they also hold really well post-storage, so you can plant a lot of them and not worry about them deteriorating in the field. You can get them out of the field and store them. Typically planted in June through August for fall to winter harvests. So all these cabbage varieties we're doing for the winter garden are all planted at the same time, then different varieties mature at differing times. You want to make sure that they're nice and tight and firm when you harvest them. So usually it's around 5 or 6 inches in diameter. There are exceptions for different varieties. You'll need to study up a little bit on the individual variety you're growing, but it's better to get them in the winter with nice big hard heads than it is to get them out in the early fall when the heads are still a little loose and haven't maybe tightened down as much. They do have some temperature risks for some varieties. In fact, most varieties. Somewhere around 15 to 20 degrees is often damaging to cabbage. They also get slugs in them, which can be an obnoxious problem when you're trying to winter garden them. You want to harvest by cutting entire heads off, and that plant is done at that point. When you're taking the head, don't just take the ball, take 2 or 3 of the outer wrapping leaves to make sure you're not damaging that and to give you a chance to clean them up nicely before going into long-term storage. If you're going to use them fresh right away, well and good. If you're going to store them, you want to make sure you get them air dried. Usually harvesting in the winter, they're sopping wet, even if it's not raining. Get them shaken out and lightly air dried before you put them into refrigeration. High humidity refrigeration storage will hold cabbage heads for 4 or 5 months for some of the better storing varieties. Traditional fall varieties with moderate storage, Alcosa, Ruby Ball, very traditional varieties. January King and Feilderkraut, which is one of those big pyramidal structured cabbages, harvest late November going into December. They store pretty well in the field. They hold up really well in refrigeration. If you want one to go out and pick in the garden in January and February, try Tundra. It's at least 10 degrees hardier than most other varieties. A good chance of making it all winter here. Cauliflower is a bit of a finicky plant, planted in the summer for fall, winter, overwintered harvest. Again, like with cabbage, you plant all the varieties, different varieties at the same time, but they ripen at different maturation periods. They are not really hardy. They also don't really store supremely well, even under refrigeration. So don't overplant too much cauliflower into the garden. Row covers or cold frames can change that figure, though. If you've got good protection on them, you can get them very late into the season. Typically, cauliflower will start taking damage around 20 to 25 degrees. Even 28 degrees, if they've already started to curd, is pretty hard on them. So varieties will harvest September to October. or December to January for winter harvest varieties, or February to March for overwintering varieties. I've had far more success getting late fall cauliflower out in October to November than I have winter harvesting because there's so many weather variables here. Once they're out of the ground, they can hold a couple of weeks in refrigeration. Varieties that are particularly cold adapted and do well as a winter crop or a late fall crop include Snow Crown, Medallion, and Purple Cape. Chicory, another fun leaf crop to play with. So chicory is kind of a broad term. It includes endive, endive. They're different, but it's a technical thing. They're really slow to develop by leaf crop standards, but they're quite productive. Typically planted in midsummer for fall, winter, overwintering harvest. So Belgian endive is a root that is then forced out for greens, and it's typically quite rich and but relatively bitter. Escarole or Batavian are easier to just garden grow, and it's typically what we'll be talking about, and that's endive at that point. Harvest escarole fall through early winter. Light frost is good on them. You can extend that harvest dramatically with moderate protection, even just floating row covers. Theoretically, you can get them all winter for a February harvest. They tend to hold up pretty well all in all here. Radicchio, another chicory, is more of a head crop, more like a cabbage. October to November harvest is pretty typical, but it's more cold tolerant than escarole. And it's not uncommon to be harvesting them around Christmas time even. For all varieties, you get them out of the ground. Radicchio is usually cutting whole heads. The endives are usually leaf harvest. You can central cut, and theoretically they'll regrow, but if you're doing that in the winter, you're not going to get any regrow. If you're looking for a sustained harvest of chicories, plant enough that you can outer leaf harvest, and they will keep slowly producing through the winter. Get them, again, shaken off, loosely air dried, and stored in refrigeration, but storage is pretty limited, 3 or 4 weeks under refrigeration at most. So plant small successions of harvest so you don't have all of it ready at once, and cover it for a longer sustained harvest rather than trying to get it all out of the ground. Some varieties, on the escarole, Benefine and Salencan hold up better at colder temperatures. Sugarloaf radicchios and Luna Rosa. I've done the sugarloaf, I haven't done Luna Rosa, but that's what I hear. Really good winter field storage life, much more hardier. Collards, another green crop that is definitely at its best flavor after some frost. Planted seeds in the early to midsummer. It takes a while to develop up. They need to really get a decent size before the cold weather sets in to be worth anything. They will produce quite well standalone, but they'll produce better if you can extend that growing season a little bit with some row covers. Harvest leaves in small volumes, frequently from the bottom and outside up to keep the harvest going. Under good conditions, you can keep them going with harvest October all the way through February potentially. They really are best used fresh. They don't, again, refrigerate like most greens crops. Top crop is probably still the #1 crop, although flash some adherence as well. Vates has a good reputation as well. Corn salad, a fun weed from Western Europe that the farmers would eat over the winter in their grain fields when nothing else was growing, and has become kind of a cultivated crop. Sold under a lot of names, but there's not actually that much variation in the plant. It might be sold under Vit or Mache or a whole batch of other things. It's probably our most overall reliable winter crop without protection. Seeds can be planted as late as August to early September and still crop. Best use fresh. It doesn't store worth a darn. Vit, Mache, Rapunzel lettuce, Vogelsalat, Feldsalat, they're all basically the same. You won't see much variation in them. You're harvesting whole plants out of the ground frequently as they size up, but that means to have any kind of sustained harvest, you need to plant a lot of corn salad. Get a question?
Yeah, are there some varieties that are larger? I mean, the ones I've grown are tiny.
They're tiny. That's why you're harvesting whole plants for the most part. None of them are very big. Kale, probably the easiest winter greens crop. Literally all season. I will normally plant my kale in the spring for summer, fall, winter, early spring harvest, and then it bolts as a biennial. Very cold hardy, usually below 10 degrees in terms of overall hardiness. Harvesting a few leaves at a time, outside and bottom leaves up, keeps the plant growing. Aphids and cabbage loopers and other caterpillars are a serious problem. So are birds. Songbirds are pretty hard on the kale. Now, I've hit my piece with the songbirds because the more songbirds I have putting holes in my kale, the less aphids and caterpillars I'm washing off of them. So that's a beneficial trade-off in my opinion. They don't store well, so just harvest what you need as you need. They normally hold quite well in the field clear through the winter. I like what you see there, Nero di Toscana, sometimes called dinosaur kale. That's, again, pictures in my garden a couple of weeks ago in December, early December. Winter boar, red Russian, prism, Scottish and Siberian kales, the frillier kales, despite their look, are still quite hardy and well worth growing as well. Kohlrabi. So we think of it like a root crop, but really it's not a root you're eating. It's a swollen section of stem. It's usually planted in the spring for summer or in the early summer for fall to winter. It's really quite a hardy crop. Good to leave in the ground and harvest a few at a time as you need, clear into and even through the winter. Typically, out of any given planting, you'll find that they size at a slightly variable rate. So just pick them as you need them at that 3 to 4 inch size. For most varieties, much past 4 inch, they start getting kind of woody and tough. There are exceptions. There are some varieties that do get bigger than that. When you're harvesting them, get them pulled out of the ground. You're destruction harvesting the plant every time you take one, so you're taking the whole stem. Cut the bottoms off, the root system off, cut the leaves off, wash them, get them air dried, store again in a plastic bag or a humidity controlling device in refrigeration for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. They'll hold up okay in refrigeration, but they're really best just left in the ground and picked as you need as much as possible. They're quite hardy. The delicacy series, there's a white and a red in that series, do quite well. If you really want a big one or one that holds forever in the garden, the old-fashioned Super Schmelz is still a champion variety. Leeks take a very long time to produce, but are again quite hardy crop for harvesting literally all winter long. For most leek varieties, you want to plant them in June to July for harvest fall through winter, and you want to harvest them as they're reaching something around a ½ inch in diameter. You can get them a little bigger, but they start declining in quality much past that. There are some varieties that are definitely bigger. Don't over harvest, they don't store. Your harvest is to get them out of the ground, derooted, washed, and the green parts of the tops cut off. At that point, you can hold them for hours to a few days until use, but again, don't over harvest your leeks, or they don't hold. They're hardy enough to store quite well in the ground. Look at where they grow them. I mean, look at the variety names. Oslo. Right? These are very north climate plants. They hold up well in the ground as long as you don't have too many rodent pests going. Giant of Musselburgh is a fun one to play with if you really like your leek soups and such. It's perhaps not the best flavored leek. It's not bad, but it's massive. It's 2 inches sometimes. It can be a very large leek. Lettuce always looks delicate. People think it's delicate, but it's actually one of the hardiest green crops out there. I've sown lettuce in January and gotten a crop out of it. You can. You're much ahead to wait till March, but you can. Typically direct sown from seed in the spring for summer harvest or in the late summer for fall and winter harvest. You can also pre-sprout them in containers and then transplant them out. It doesn't store, so don't plan on storing it for long periods of time. Put smaller plantings in at a time with a 30 to 40 day turnaround or so, so multiple plantings for sustained harvest. If you're planting in the spring and you're keeping them picked, theoretically, you could probably keep them going as a biennial crop. They won't bolt till spring, but they bitter and you start having serious problems unless you're perfect at keeping them irrigated, fed, and picked. You're much ahead to simply start a new crop in the midsummer for later harvests. Row covers or cold frames can keep you harvesting fall and winter, even without row covers and cold frames, as long as they're not getting smothered out by weeds or otherwise pounded to death by the weather. It's real common for my lettuce to die back in the fall and then resprout in February for a final crop before bolting. Typically in the summer, leaf lettuces, I'll harvest whole plants and just let them regrow from short stubs. If you're trying to get a sustained harvest going through the winter under a cold frame, unless you have tons of it planted, just pick a few outer leaves at a time and let them keep flushing instead. Parsnip. So think of it like a carrot, erratic germination, and needs quite a bit of thinning and very slow germinating. But it's one of the few crops I strongly recommend growing through for January harvest in the Pacific Northwest. It really holds up that well. So timing is the trick with parsnips. You plant them in late May to early June for harvest in the fall to winter. You can really harvest them anytime they're sizing up. They're best after we've had some substantially cold weather, usually November or later. They ground store really, really well. You can treat them like a carrot, wash them and refrigerate them, but you just don't need to. They hold up so well in the ground. Javelin, Gladiator are my top varieties. Rutabagas, an early planting crop, again, July, for a harvest in November to December. I've still got rutabagas in the field right now, although I've picked a batch of them. They do require some thinning because they take up a fair amount of space and you have an erratic enough growth pattern from seed that you often need to plant plenty. You want to harvest them usually between 3 and 4, 5 inches, maybe up to 6 inches in diameter, so bigger than your average turnip. They do hold up well in the ground if you don't have super saturated soil. I have to be careful where I plant mine, or too much insect damage. Usually don't need to dig them. They'll pull readily out of the ground. Just grab a hold of them and they'll pull right up, even though they've got a fairly deep tap. Get them washed, tops trimmed, hair roots trimmed off, and then they will refrigerate store also for quite an extensive period of time, usually several months. They hold up well enough in the ground. That's often not an issue. However, by the end of December, first part of January, they're starting to get woody. So get them out before you get that far on it. Marion and Joan are some of the newer varieties. You still see a lot of old varieties around, but Marion and Joan will hold their textures better later into the season and to bigger sizes, even 7, 8, 9 inches. Spinach is a cool season crop that is a shoulder crop. You harvest it in the fall or you harvest it in the spring, but unless you're doing some substantial temperature protection, you don't usually get it through the winter, and it declines very badly in the summer. August plantings are September through October or November harvest with some row covers. September plantings will harvest the following spring and would still benefit from covers to make sure they make it through the winter okay. Watch slug damage early in the season in particular. Bloomsdale is a variety if you're running towards the warmer end of the season for a spring overwintered spring harvest. It holds up better as the season warms up. Olympia and Tyee are classic varieties widely used. Tundra is a variety that will hold up better later into the season if you're trying to extend that harvest in the fall. And turnips, like rutabagas, but smaller, and they don't ground store as well. So you do have to be a little more careful about getting them out of the ground. Planted about the same time, usually a July seeding. You can get away with an August seeding, where I've never successfully grown rutabagas by seeding them as late as August. They do hold in refrigeration just as well, so worth growing them as a substantial winter crop. They're quicker to mature. They're normally harvested somewhere between 3 and 4 inches of diameter, and much larger than that, they start declining in quality pretty rapidly. Again, they should pull out of the ground readily without much digging. Trim the tops and the fine roots, wash, air dry, and then refrigerate, and they will hold for several months. There's a lot of varieties out there. There's not necessarily tons and tons of variation, except in some of the high sugar varieties again. Purple top is old-fashioned classic. Kanamachi is a smaller white or Tokyo type, very sweet, but smaller diameter. And Golden Ball is one that holds a little bit better later into the season and later in the ground without going bad. So quick basket shot of some of the stuff that I harvested. Garlic and onions were harvested in June. Potatoes were harvested in July. Sweet potatoes were harvested carrots were harvested in October. Sweet potatoes were harvested in November. Those are all still sitting out there in storage in my space right now. I know I ran just a bit over for you, but I'm still hanging around if you guys got any questions for me.
That was fabulous, Darren. I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Kick it off. Amongst the potatoes, going back to that section.
Yes.
Do you find that whether you're talking or I said potatoes, I meant beets. Whether you're storing the reds or the yellows, beet varieties you have better storage success or better yield success?
So, yields versus storage. Okay, so difference between red and some of the yellow or other colored like Chioggia, Zone 8 beets. It's more a variety by variety thing than it is a color specific thing. There are some very good, durable, high yielding, Touchstone, for example. Yeah.
You had both yellow and red in
Yeah.
the list, but that's why I asked.
Very few of the Zone 8 types hold up as well for late season gardening, although the yields are still pretty good and the refrigerated storage is still fairly good on them. Yeah. Yes.
Carrot rooted beets,
Yeah.
or better in the soil?
So carrot rooted beets, and I wish I had a definitive answer for you. Yes, generally they ground store pretty well. No beets hold up once we get sodden out there. If you got really good raised beds with good drainage, decent chance of holding them later. My problem is that's really not an option in my garden. I have no place that is dry enough for that. The rutabagas hold up, the beets do not. So they are more picky about that. But yes, in theory, they're supposed to, but I have not done that one personally.
Question about sweet potatoes. I have some ornamental sweet potatoes in pots,
Mhm.
and I noticed that they have some big sweet potatoes.
Mhm.
So you can eat them, right?
Yes, so the sweet potatoes you get as ornamental hanging basket plants, if you keep them growing over the summer, will size up a tuber. If you're growing them organically from that point, you're probably fine. Be aware that the people who are producing those do not produce them like a vegetable crop. We do not know for sure what pesticide products have been used in production on them. So that's the only concern I'd have about that. I've done that actually. I've dug them and eaten them. They're not as good as the edible varieties, but yes, they are edible. Yes.
Is your lecture slides online anywhere?
That's one of the things that I wanted to comment on. So this is our first attempt at using the library's new Zoom AV system, and we are recording this. There are slides as well as a PDF will hopefully both be available. I mean, for sure, I've already got the slide deck. So the slide deck will definitely be posted on the Benton County Master Gardeners website, which is the host location for the Public Seed Library Resources webpage. And for those of you that don't already know this, in the Public Seed Library itself, there's a variety of flyers and there's a QR code. So you can just read the QR code and it'll take you right there. So you can find it that way if you don't remember to search for the Benton County Master Gardeners website. It's under resources. Thank you
Yes.
for asking.
I planted a bunch of brassicas for fall, for winter harvest. And they're feeding everybody but me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is, yeah, pests in the brassicas. So the brassicas are infamous for caterpillars, beetles, whiteflies, aphids, slugs, everything.
I think it's cutworms that are getting mine.
Yep.
Yes, cutworms, yes.
Yeah.
So, a few guidelines. Cutworms. You can make or you can buy from like Territorial Seed Company discs that go around the stems of your cole crops to keep the cutworms from getting into the stem and cutting for young transplants. Is where it's the biggest problem. Cabbage root maggots. This is a real problem with summer planting. You plant them in the spring for summer harvest, you don't really have much root maggot problem. But planted in the summer for fall and winter harvest, the root maggot population is substantial. So from the moment you see sprouting on direct sown crops, or from the moment you transplant young seedlings, put an insect barrier or floating row cover over them until they have had about 4 weeks in the ground. At that point in time, it's a fly, lays its eggs on the soil right adjacent to the stem, then the maggot goes down. Once they're that big, they won't be targeted anymore. But that's critical. Aphids, caterpillars, whiteflies, scout for populations regularly. There's no substitute for spending time in the garden. Organic insecticides, I use neem. It's very safe and very effective for most insects, very generalist. If it's specifically caterpillar problems, I would use spinosad over BT. So they have the same mode of action. BT is actually a bacterial insecticide. Spinosad is the protein toxins from bacterial fermentation. So it's killing the same way. It's just they're isolating the actual toxins from the bacteria rather than using the bacteria themselves. Slugs bait early, frequently, and late. And I use organic slug baits like Sluggo iron phosphate baits. They're more animal safe. They're also more effective in the colder, wetter parts of the year. The old metaldehyde baits are simply paralants. The slug is paralyzed until it dehydrates to death. In our climate, they don't always dehydrate to death. Sometimes the metaldehyde wears off and they just crawl away. Iron phosphate's a stomach poison. It kills them through ingestion.
I'll insert after that comment. That's one of the items that can be purchased very economically through the 10 Rivers Food Web sale, the slug bait with the chemical, the newer chemical. Approach, right? In a large fish container at a very affordable price. And I bought it last year and it was awesome. Because I had the same problem.
It's also, yeah, worth mentioning that general organic gardening processes and techniques are important. So weed control. A lot of your weeds in your garden host these same insect pests that move on to your crop plants. And this is really important in the winter garden because a lot of those weeds grow faster than your garden plants. So yeah.
Well, I had a question about carrots, but when you said that, I realized a bigger question is, so I put all these leaves to mulch my beds. And I feel like what I'm doing is feeding all of the slugs and all these other things. So what's the balance there? But my initial question about carrots was, so I've got carrots that are maybe an inch long. And if, is that just it? I just pull them out and have inch carrots, or is leaving those, will they in some point start to grow again?
Okay.
Yeah.
Most varieties of carrots, again, there's some exceptions in the specific overwintering varieties. Most varieties of carrots, once they've hit a stage where they've stopped growing due to the cold weather, they become woody and hairy. And so, well, they do. It's instead of this nice clean cylinder, you've got they're just matted in small fine roots. At that point, they're done. Yeah, so get out what you can, use them. Will they start growing again in February? Yes, but the carrot is unlikely to be usable past that. It's like if you ever wild harvest Queen Anne's lace, if you get them young, they're great. And then once you've hit that point, you can't actually even chew them. They get so hard. It happens with carrots as well. Yeah. Okay, leaves. So using dead leaves as a mulch in the garden is a time-proven way of providing micronutrients and protecting soil compaction. It does create an interface zone where certain pests, several types of beetles, sometimes rodents, and particularly slugs like to live. Balancing act, it's probably net beneficial as long as you're baiting. It needs to be incorporated in. You can't put a leaf cover on, then decide it's time to plant, but it's not finished decomposing and take it off, because that's all carbonaceous mass, and the bacterial decomposition cycle that's making that break down into soil is taking nitrogen out of the soil for those bacteria to reproduce on. And so if you start that decompositional cycle and then you haul those leaves and those bacteria somewhere else, you've just stripped all the nitrogen out of your soil. So don't do that.
So mix it in.
Mix it in at the end of the season, even if they're not completely decomposed. Be aware of allelopathy on anything that's not fully decomposed. So if they're still pretty crunchy and you're incorporating them, you may need to wait another 2 to 3 weeks before planting.
I had a couple of observations on cold crops about the root maggots and cabbage loopers in particular. I noticed that if you throw a fistful of sawdust around your transplants, cold transplants, seems to discourage the fly.
Mhm.
And if you can't use a row cover, that's even. But I've also observed, you've probably seen those paper wasps. They make the open cell, small open cell nests in the eaves in the house and stuff, predate heavily on that cabbage moth.
Yeah.
To the point where I started tagging up nesting boxes along the fence for these guys. They're really effective.
We have a batch of different thread-waisted wasps in this area, and they're really a lot of fun because the adults are nectar feeders. And so they do work as minor pollinators as well, but they're also parasitic in their larval stage upon either spiders or caterpillars, depending on which species you're looking at. So we have some fun ichneumons. There's some really nice mahogany colored ones. Also the traditional yellow striped ones, the little paper ones. Yeah, and they're great. Encouraging beneficial insects is great. And one of the ways you can encourage those to participate in your garden is by interplanting small flowered crops, and particularly herb crops like dill, coriander, and letting them flower out in the garden, because that's what those types of insects actually feed on in their adult stage. Sawdust.
Interject there. This gentleman's going to be presenting a presentation on that topic in, is it March or April?
You'll have to look at my schedule and tell me.
But something I've said, this is something that we want to encourage. We want to share this information. So more coming soon from this man on that topic.
Sawdust, and that's the same point with those discs around them. They do cutworms, but they also protect from cabbage maggots. Sawdust is effective, so are hazelnut shells. The caution with carbonaceous mass, using bark dust or sawdust, your brassicas are really, really nitrogen hungry. So if you're doing that kind of bordering around them or mulching around them, make sure you're feeding plenty well to make up for the nitrogen lost during decomposition. Yes.
I have oak leaves in my yard and only oak leaves.
Mhm.
And they are not breaking down.
No. Okay, so leaves and types of leaves. Big problems here. Oak. We're not really in an area where you get that much eucalyptus, but eucalyptus leaves, they do not decompose. They have growth inhibitors specifically in the leaves, tannins in the case of oaks, menthols in the case of eucalypt. The trick to them is to pre-compost them. Pile them into a compost with some green materials, some manures or some nitrogen fertilizers, get them partly broken down, leach the tannins out, and then put them in the garden. They're fine. Not only do they not break down in the garden, they're actually growth inhibitive in the garden. They actually give off chemicals that stop other plants from growing. So be cautious about where your leaf sources are coming from. Maple is generally fine. Alder's fine. We see a lot of maple leaf in our composts primarily at this point. But yeah, oak is a problem. Walnut is worse.
Yes.
Yeah, Euglos, substantial growth inhibitor.
I have driven around and picked up other people's.
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, I want those.
Yeah, and they bring a lot of leaves if you live off of Walnut.
Yeah.
Bring a lot of leaves to MLK Park, and I go there with my black plastic trash bags and think, oh my gosh, I hope nobody's sick.
We're all dumpster divers of one sort or another. If we are gardeners, we're dumpster divers. Do not be ashamed. You're a good company. Yeah.
I have one more question, if I may. Row covers, I put some new row covers this year. You just keep them on the whole time, the whole winter?
Yeah, for the winter, yeah.
The two sides, all the sides have to be completely closed.
Yeah, they have to be closed down. So floating row covers are lightweight spun materials that are let most light and a reasonable amount of water through. They're light enough you can actually drape on top of the foliage of the plants, or you can build frames and keep them up. Either approach works. They need to be anchored down to one extent or another on all sides to keep air from coming in under them for frost protection. So for me, that's usually throwing a few clods or shoveling small amounts of dirt on the edges to hold them in place. It depends on the crop whether I let them sit on the foliage. You know, well-developed brassicas like bigger kales, or if you're doing broccoli and cauliflower that you've already got some size on, I'll normally just drape them over and adjust them every couple of weeks as the plant continues to slowly grow. Leaf crops like lettuce and spinach, where I'm using that, I'll actually make some little stake props, and so they're draping over and they're being propped up because they actually compress those leaf crops pretty hard despite their lightweight. Good idea to get them up off the foliage in that case. This is different from like sheet plastic, which doesn't let, clear plastic lets light through but no water through, and cannot be actually in contact with the leaf surfaces. You not only breed diseases in that contact point, but it flash freezes right through the plastic where the plastic is making contact with the leaf. So definitely some advantages to using those spun materials over other.
It won't get too hot in here.
Not this time of year. You do have to be careful if you're keeping those all the way into March.
I'm wondering about the rodents.
Pardon?
Encourage like rats and.
I've never had a real problem with rat problem getting under that. No more so than you would have just in having, plants around the perimeter of the garden or whatnot. I have plenty of rats in the berry piles on the other side of the garden. I never see them in the garden. Yeah.
I've not had that trouble with my beds either. Not only do I want to give thanks to this man, but I want to make sure, coming back to the comments about brassicas and pests. Steve Solomon's book, available here from the library. Both here and on the territorial website, I found some insightful information that helped me with my brassica pest problems. That's worthy of knowing about, and it included using BT as a killer with, as I recall, wheat bran, and placing that kind of some of the concept of putting it around the stemish area of new transplants. I tried it. I killed. I had evidence that I killed. So yeah, anyway.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.